We will be starting in a few minutes. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our early year Zoom. We're going to be starting shortly. So I'm just going to explain some of the accessibility features of this call for some people who have not joined us before. We have Sam Riddle providing interpretation for BSL this evening, and we also have subtitles and live captions and a transcript available on this call. They're not currently available just now. They'll be available in about 2 minutes. There's just a slight technical problem, but on the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to see a button that says show subtitles and live transcript. That means you'll be able to download it. We have a technical team assisting tonight, so if you need any help, then put a message in the chat and we'll be able to help you. We're also live streaming this on social media, just so that you're aware. And we have a significant number of people on this call and on social media as well. So thank you very much. I'm going to introduce you to the National President, Robin Bevan.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you for all your superb work in setting up this call, and thank you to Lawson, Henry, Mike, Mari and Jack, who are working behind the scenes to ensure that we have a very straightforward opportunity this evening to speak with the early years teacher and support staff members within the National Education Union. A very, very warm welcome to all of you. I was reflecting before the call started, how on earth can I express my appreciation to all those of you who work in the early years settings. As many of you know, as well as being your elected national president, I am a serving head teacher, but my working life immerses me in an environment with 1,300 adolescents on a daily basis. And I'm guessing quite a lot of you on the call wouldn't particularly want to do that job. But in contrast, I utterly admire what you do day in, day out in early years and nursery and reception settings. It is extraordinary. And I was thinking back to my own very first year in infant school. I started as a 4-year-old, and I can still remember just that sense of calmness, of play, of stories, of learning, of creativity, of delight. And I owe it all to one teacher whose name I'm going to mention. Her name is Mrs. Bevan. And throughout my life, she has also been known to me as Mum. So thank you, Mum. You were my very first teacher. And I know now that I work as a professional educator, what an extraordinary job you were doing with a full class back in the 1970s. A very warm welcome to everybody onto the call. Please do post any questions that you have in the Q&A function, but we would ask that you just wait a moment before you do that until you've heard from Kevin and Mary, so that your questions then are questions that allow us to expand on what Kevin and Mary have said. It's fabulous to see so many of you saying hello in the chat function, but quite a lot of you are only saying hello to members of the panel. You'll notice that in the chat function, there's a little box that you can drop down to change from all panelists to all panelists and attendees. So Andy Summers from Warwickshire, you've said hello to the panel, but not to everybody else. Catherine Gardner from Islington, good evening, welcome. You've said hello to the panel, but not everybody else. Kathy Clark, all the way down there in St Barnabas in Cornwall. Just please change that little drop down so that you can say hello to everybody. Tonight's call is being recorded, the chat is being recorded, the video and audio is being recorded. As Mike has already said, it's being live streamed. We do have a very simple behaviour statement that was posted earlier in the chat. All I would ask of you is that in a situation where many of us feel strongly about the issues that are facing the early years sector, that we exchange our views and make our comments with all due respect to everybody on the call. I know that you have found yourselves in an extraordinarily challenging position. The union is here to support you, and I'm going to hand over to your joint general secretaries who will talk you through some of the issues that your sector is facing. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Robin, and thank you very much for that introduction as well. We are really pleased to have you as our president this year during these tumultuous times. And good evening to everybody on the call. We had more than 1,000 registered. I can see more than 700 on the call already. Early years professionals from PVI, from maintained nursery schools, from nursery classes in schools able to join us tonight. Thank you very much for being here. We want to spend a few minutes talking through the issues that we know the sector is facing, and then to take your questions. But before we do that, we want to thank you for your work throughout the pandemic. We believe that early years education is essential for children's development and well-being. And in particular, we know how essential early years education is for children from disadvantaged families. We think you do amazing work, and we think that your work is too often undervalued by politicians and by our society. We heard Nick Gibb, the schools minister, say in the House of Commons in March that continuously improving this country's education system starts with early years, he said. High quality early education can have a huge impact on children's development, not just when they're in the education system, but throughout their life. He said the government's ambition was to provide equality of every opportunity for every child, regardless of background or where they live, and to improve access to high quality early education across the country. Fine words. We know the reality is different. Even before this pandemic, your sector faced a crisis of funding, which we highlighted in our campaigns in previous years. In contrast to Nick Gibb's words about high quality early years education, the reality is that pupil-teacher ratios have increased during the period of coalition and Conservative government. In 2010, there were 16 pupils per teacher. By 2018, 23. So running down the sector across that whole period. And during the lockdown, the crisis has deepened for every kind of setting, for local authority and private settings. A survey carried out by the Private Sector Early Years Alliance in November found that 1/4 of childcare providers believed that without a change in government's approach to funding, they would cease to be viable within 6 months.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be on this call with you, as Kevin and Robin has said. So Kevin's outlined the crisis facing the sector, and adding to the crisis in funding and in support for the sector, we also have a social crisis, because early years staff are also having to face the effects of lockdown on children and families. There is increased poverty. The rate of child poverty and family poverty in this country is going through the roof, as are parents and carers' worries about whether they can pay the rent, the numbers are facing eviction because they can't pay the bills and they can't pay the rent, and increased concerns about children's nutrition, their accommodation, whether they can afford warm clothes for the winter, parents increasingly stressed, and poverty in some cases, we know, unfortunately, increases domestic abuse. And we also know that support services for children who need them, for example, speech and language therapy, child psychiatry and social care, have been suspended in the pandemic for long periods. Those children who really need them haven't been able to get hold of those support services and specialists. And so the impact of the lack of support and of the increase in child poverty is felt by you. And it's a threat to your health and well-being and a threat to your work. Research by the Education Policy Institute in December found that 4% of staff in early years settings had been made redundant since the start of the pandemic, and that 7% of staff had voluntarily terminated their contract. Early years settings report employing 9% fewer staff in August than in March. That's a huge reduction, nearly a 10% reduction in staffing in early years environments. And these redundancies most strongly affect the least qualified staff. So I want to echo Kevin and Robin's thanks for all that you are doing and will continue to do throughout this pandemic for the children in your care and for your families. Now, we know that Boris Johnson's announcement last Monday, that nurseries would remain fully open, it shocked the sector. The government's strong message under lockdown was telling everyone to stay at home and to keep school children at home where possible. And that sits in stark contrast with the messages to the early years sector to remain open. And we know that this is causing confusion and concern. Government has not provided clear and persuasive evidence to the sector or to parents to show it is safe for early years settings to remain open. And we have written to the government asking for this advice and asking for their evidence that it is safe for early years centres to remain open. We haven't had a reply to our letter. Early years practitioners, all of you, need urgent reassurance for your safety. That you need to know your safety is being prioritised. For example, by urgent action to make regular mass testing available to early years practitioners, and then by ministers making the case to the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation for early years practitioners to be prioritised for vaccination, along with teachers and support staff. School leaders and setting leaders are ultimately responsible for carrying out risk assessments as to whether or not it is safe to remain open. However, they are under huge amounts of pressure. They feel national policy is pushing them one way, to remain open for all pupils, and indeed their funding situation is absolutely pushing them that way, whilst their risk assessments are pushing them in another way. And they are ultimately being left to carry the can for these very serious decisions. DfE guidance states, we understand that it may not be possible for all settings to be open at this time. However, that understanding is not reflected in the messaging from the government and from the Department for Education. And the decision to fund attendance, to fund early years sectors on the basis of attendance, instead of continuing what the government did previously to fund at pre-COVID levels, as was the case for the last two terms, is causing real problems. We know of nurseries, got worked examples of nurseries who were, doing fine, had some money in reserves, and now they are really in deficit and do not know how they're going to make that decline in funding and that deficit up.
So we agree with our members and with managers and proprietors in maintained nursery schools, PVI settings, who are emphasising, we agree with this, that there is no rationale for those settings to be open to all children when primary schools are not. Some maintained nursery schools are as large as some primaries. Some settings have children of reception age and yet are advised to remain open when schools are being told that reception age children should remain at home on the same basis as older primary children. Some PVI and maintained nursery settings, because of the nature of their buildings, are working with bubbles of children and staff which are larger than typical primary school classes, even double the size in some cases. But these settings are being required to stay fully open and yet do not have guaranteed funding, while primary schools, rightly, continue to receive funding for statutory age pupils as normal. That has to be extended to early years settings. We need to get these cases down. We need to get the number of children down, because we need to reduce the total number of contacts in our society, not just children, but parents bringing their children to the settings as well. Today, we hear that more than 1,500 people died of COVID in the last 24 hours. The Prime Minister, speaking to MPs today, said there is a real danger of intensive care units being overwhelmed. We need to get the total number of social contacts down, and one way of doing that is to restrict early years settings to those who really need to be there, the children of key workers and to vulnerable children. And I can see in the chat that lots of members are reporting that this is happening in some places. Now, in December, ministers at the DfE decided to stop funding the early years sector on pre-COVID levels and to revert the funding to revert to funding the early education entitlements on the basis of attendance. That decision has got to be reversed as a matter of urgency. They made the decision to change the funding model when they thought it was likely that occupancy levels would be approaching normal levels this term. It is now absolutely clear that that will not be the case. In many cases, and I'm seeing this in the chat as well, even where early years settings aren't restricting, parents are opting to keep their children at home due to safety concerns. So numbers attending are in some cases only a fraction of the numbers on roll. We need your settings when we come out of this pandemic. The government has to guarantee funding so that you're still there when we come out. Many settings are not able to open to all children due to staff absences, because staff are ill or self-isolating or clinically extremely vulnerable, or due to risk assessments they cannot open. In such cases, they are continuing to provide support for home learning for those children not able to attend. So it's not the case that they're not providing education. It would be completely unjust not to fund the setting for continuing to support children at home, as is happening in primary and secondary schools. Now, even if all children on the roll were fully funded, in most cases, this would still reflect a fall compared to usual numbers, as many eligible January starters parents will have held back on taking up a place because of the virus. This is putting a pressure on already overstretched budgets. Without urgent confirmation of full funding to early entitlement places, early years providers will not be able to remain open post the pandemic for all children. Funding for the sector is already on a knife edge, with huge loss of income over the past 9 months and additional costs that have not been covered by government support. We are hearing of a variety of responses from local authorities who are clearly trying to balance their understanding of these challenges with the government guidance on funding and opening. We urgently need a clear national policy so that all local authorities do as well as the best, so that settings and schools are not dependent on their local authorities' sympathy and instead can expect a consistent approach on support and funding.
So what is the NEU doing to support early years practitioners and settings? We have launched a campaign working with the APPG, the AHT, Unison, the National Day Nurseries Association, the Early Years Alliance, the Daily Mirror, and others. And this campaign aims to unite all early years sectors throughout the campaign and to press for a new deal for early years, those most crucial years in a child's development. Absolutely crucial. So we want a new deal for early years education. We want to unite all the early years sector through the campaign, and we want to ensure the safety of nursery and early years members who are not included in the lockdown, including raising demands on testing and vaccination. And we want to safeguard the sector. We want to safeguard funding for the sector from the government, even when there are periods of closure, because if the government doesn't protect early years provision and doesn't safeguard funding, then the danger is that settings will close and they won't reopen again after the pandemic. If the government wants to get the nation back to work, and if it wants to support particularly disadvantaged children who benefit the most from early years provision, then it needs to safeguard these centres. It needs to safeguard early years provision, and it needs to make sure there is a sector which is viable when the pandemic is over. So we are demanding financial recovery plans for nurseries and early years settings. We are demanding that our members in these settings are safe. We're demanding that the nursery schools and early years don't act as vectors for transmission back into the community. The campaign includes many early years settings, including maintained nursery schools, nursery classes which are attached to or within a school, independent schools, nursery schools, preschools, and private day nurseries. And we're going to promote the campaign really energetically in the press and through social media. And we're going to collect video testimony from our nursery heads and members. And we're going to explain and compare how different countries treat their early years sector and explain the importance of early years education for children's emotional and social and physical development. We have yesterday launched a petition with all these demands, and last night we learned that over 7,000 people have actually signed it. We really want you to sign the petition, and it will the link to the petition will be out in the chat, and we want you to promote it. The more signatures we get, the better. And so get all your friends and all your colleagues and your family and everyone you know to sign. If it wasn't COVID and if it wasn't social distancing, I'd say grab people in the street and sign, but you mustn't do that. You must get people in the socially distanced way to sign the petition. We've got letters being sent to MPs. Over 3,000 letters have now, in the course of 24 hours, been sent to MPs promoting the demands in the petition. So we want you to send a letter to your MP. We've got a model letter, which will come through the chat, which we want you to sign and send to your MP. And we're asking you to tweet about the petition and the campaign to MPs. So we're saying we want all nurseries and early years settings to reduce their numbers of children attending in the same way and on the same timescale as primary schools. We want immediate provision of emergency funding to the early years sector to cover the additional costs in relation to COVID-19, as has rightly been given, not enough, but some additional funding to primary and secondary schools. Crucially, this petition asks for a long-term funding formula for maintained nurseries and all settings in the early years sector as soon as possible and to cover additional costs. And we want funding allocations to be maintained for nursery on the 2019 and 2020 pupil numbers until after the pandemic is over, because we know now that there are fewer numbers in the nurseries and fewer hours above the funded hours are being taken up because parents are more at home, they're using the government funded hours but not taking up the additional hours and not paying the additional fees. So we want the numbers in nurseries, we want nurseries to be funded on the numbers for last year, not the numbers for this year, which is going to be a huge loss of income. And we want parents who need to be furloughed so that they can look after their children to be furloughed so that they can care for their children at home.
We're already hearing and seeing some of this in the chat as well. There are councils that are being flexible on the January census for pupils. They're saying they'll use the number on roll rather than number in the school. And that's completely reasonable in the context of this COVID crisis. We want to encourage more councils to do this. We need your help to help us to encourage the councils to do it. So if you're on this call, if there's no rep in your setting, whatever sort of setting you work in, we would like you to volunteer to become an NEU rep in your setting. You can share that with another member of staff. Whether you're amongst the 700 on this Zoom or the 1,000 watching on Facebook, we want you to volunteer to become a rep. Some of you may have seen a clip of Ruthba on the Sky News on the 11th, making the call for early years settings. She's from PVI to go to key worker and vulnerable only. She's joined the union and volunteered to be a rep. Thank you very much, Ruthba, for making that statement on Sky. We have, together with Unison, written to Gavin Williamson, asking him the scientific basis on which he made his decision that nurseries could remain open. Frankly, we do not expect a quick or full or satisfying reply, but we'll keep pressing the point. Looking forward, we need a government committed to dealing with the long-term effects of this crisis on young children, particularly for the most vulnerable children who benefit most from high quality provision. And it's going to take a well-funded, highly skilled workforce to provide the support and long-term enrichment needed for those children. And this is a campaign which is going to involve education as well as funding issues. The NEU is fighting for the interests of early years staff and of early years parents and children. One of the few good outcomes of the pandemic has been an upsurge of activity on the part of the sector fighting for itself alongside the union. The Early Years Coalition, which is financially supported by the union, is responding vigorously to the government's efforts to impose on schools and settings what the Early Years Coalition calls a prescriptive, simplistic, limited curriculum and pedagogy. In a really significant move, it is developing guidance by the sector for the early years curriculum. The campaign to defend early years settings has already made a real impact on public opinion and political attitudes. Within our own union, we have seen in recent weeks an explosion of discussion and activity. We've set up WhatsApp groups involving hundreds of members on maintained nurseries and early years more generally. A Facebook group, Value Early Years Education, had 600 people signing up in a couple of days. We are establishing an early years reference group of members to support the development of our policy. We've thrown ourselves in the campaign to get parity of treatment for early years settings so far as COVID-19 regulations are concerned. You should look out for a survey from the union tomorrow or Friday that is going to ask your views about how we take that campaign forward, and is also going to encourage you, and I'm going to encourage you again, as Mary just said, we want you to promote the petition. Ask your friends and family to sign it and to promote it. We want you to write to your MP. We want you to tweet at your MP. There's a lot going on, and sustained by the initiatives and energies of union members on the ground, as well as the efforts we're making from the centre, we will make progress. There's much to be learned. There is much to be done, and let's work on it together. So we'll hand over now for your questions, and thank you for being here again.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Mary. And amongst the comments in the chat, some real appreciation for the work that the union has been doing. Catherine Gardner saying, I think fairly, that it is the union that is the one place that is speaking up, speaking out, and having an impact to benefit and look after those who are working in the early years sector. Lucy Coleman making a particular reference to the importance of early years provision, how it's valued in other countries, and the importance of us ensuring that it's valued in the same way in our own country. We're going to start looking at some of the questions that have been posted. Thank you so very much for all of them that are coming in. Please remember that all the questions that are posted tonight will be kept, will be looked at, and will inform our advice on the website and in other media. The same is true of the chat. So please keep giving us helpful information as we go. And the first set of questions are around feeling safe and being safe in the workplace. And Kevin, I'm going to come to you with three questions. They overlap, but it's good to hear different people's perspectives. So Amy Kilpatrick says, I've been contacted by several nursery teachers who want to know if their Section 44 letters are expiring, if they need to write a new letter or resubmit the original one. And she's simply asking for some help. A related question from Susan Thrower. Thank you, Susan. I work at a maintained nursery school. My head has mentioned that the letters that we submitted citing Section 44 might not be valid. Can you clarify the NEU's position on this? And Adam Lane, thank you, Adam. I'm a teacher in a nursery school. Teaching staff have signed Section 44 letters as guided. It feels as though there's a huge amount of pressure from both the LA and national government to be fully open. Does the Section 44 guidance to only open for children of vulnerable families and key workers still stand? So that's the set of questions which I was posing to Kevin, who has just this very moment disappeared from the screen as if by magic, in the spirit of Mr. Ben. I hope he is about to return, and he has. That's fantastic. Kevin, we need you to unmute. And Kevin, did you?
I've got the questions, Robin.
You've got the questions, fabulous. Press ahead.
And
Really good to see you
really
back.
sorry about that. We've been doing these since March, and I've not had a problem with Zoom at all until the last 2 weeks, when it's crashed on me twice in 2 very big meetings. So I'm really sorry about that. And now I'm on my iPad instead of the computer. So these are questions about section 44. So I want to say to you that on Sunday, the 3rd of January, we had that huge meeting. We had 40,000 members at least for an hour. We had 100,000 people who stayed for an hour. More of them will be members, but we know that 40,000 of them were members. And we know that another 300,000, so 400,000 at all, were in part of that meeting. And at that meeting, we gave advice that we thought it was unsafe on the basis of sage advice for settings to be open, and that people should submit section 44 letters. And many thousands of members did that. The situation that then was unknown to us what would happen next. And on Monday at 8 o'clock, obviously, the Prime Minister changed the situation by taking primary schools and secondary schools, and in some cases, special schools, out of this calculation. So does our advice change in early years settings? Now, the important thing about section 44 is this, is it conveys a protection on you not to have pay docked or to be disciplined if you refuse to go and work in a setting where you have a reasonable belief of imminent and serious danger to your health or the health of other people. Now, that still applies. However, it conveys a protection that sometimes only comes into play after you've had a pay docked, and then we have to go to court and try and put that right. We don't want to get into that situation. We don't want to place you in a situation where your pay has been docked and then we're having to go to court on it. So that's why we're saying we think that these settings should be key worker and vulnerable only. Other safety measures should be in place. Section 44 is a useful tool, but we think it's really important that you come to the union if you're being challenged by your management about this, or if they're saying they want to have full opening, so that we can belt and braces, also take collective approaches that would stop anybody having pay docked or being disciplined before we reach the stage where we had to try and go to court with section 44 afterwards. So given the situation changing with primary schools and secondary schools taken out of the fight by the government's actions, we think it's important now to ensure that we've got that collective strength there alongside you, and the union is very willing to be there alongside you, taking that forward. I hope that's clear enough. It is, somebody asked, Susan said, the head said the letter was not valid. We don't agree with that at all. Gavin Williams said we'd apologised for giving wrong advice. That is absolutely not true. And hopefully you've seen the letter that we've sent to all heads and employers, absolutely refuting that and outlining all sorts of bits of health and safety legislation, including section 44 and section 100, which do apply in these situations. But even having said that, collective strength is where the union strength is. So we want you to shore up. We want to belt and braces. So come to the union if you're being challenged on these issues. It's much the best way to go forward in this particular circumstance.
And that contact, Kevin, from someone who is concerned, first of all, they should obviously talk to other members of the union in their workplace, but they should then make contact with their local branch, local district, or if they don't have a contact that they can easily find, they can come through Advice Line, who will guide them on to that contact.
That's right. And that'll get them to their regional secretary. If they're a rep, and that's why I was putting out that call for reps, they can also go directly to their regional office if they can't get through to their branch straight away. So volunteer to be a rep, then you can go directly to the regional office. And we've got lots of support mechanisms in place. Also, if you become a rep, most branches now have a reps WhatsApp group. Now that will be lots of primary school reps and secondary school reps, but there'll be other early years settings reps in that group as well. And you'll find enormous solidarity and good advice from people in that group as well.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I'm just going to take some other workplace related questions. I'm going to pass them to Mary. I'm going to read several. They do overlap, but there are some quite distinct issues in amongst them. Tammy Bickle, thank you for your question. What do we do if our school wants to open the nursery class to all pupils instead of just key workers? The school is already 50% full. I'm assuming that's with the vulnerable and key worker children. So there's no additional space or staff. We're already delivering to 60% of the class daily. Staff are concerned about their safety. It's a question essentially about numbers. Jacqueline Glenn asks a similar question about numbers. How many key worker pupils should there be in a bubble? We may not be able to give her a precise answer. We can certainly give some good guidance. And Amy is asking a question that's particularly relevant for many of those who work in the early years sector. We're currently closed as a setting due to a positive case of COVID in a child and are all having to isolate. As staff members, we're only able to be paid sick pay. And as this could happen a number of times, is there any other support available? So particular vulnerability there around income. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Robin. So, Tammy, with your question, I assume that you are a nursery class within a school, within a primary school, and you're being told that the nursery class to be open to all pupils with key workers, and the school is already half full, so there's no additional space or staff. And you're absolutely right to be very concerned about that situation, because the whole point of restricting primary school numbers to and secondary school to vulnerable children and key worker children was to lower the number of children going to school and to lower the number of adults taking children to and from school, meeting at school date. And only today, the permanent secretary at the Department for Education was saying they were trying to line that it's not that schools were vectors of transmission, although Boris Johnson said they were, but what they've done in closing schools is to reduce the number of social contacts and travel by 83%. So that's the argument they're putting forward. So if your school has got, it's 50% full, you're right on the edge. We've done the DFE also released figures today about the number of pupils in schools. And if your school is 50% full, it is very, very full. It is much fuller than the majority of primary schools. So if your head is saying that they want to open the nursery to all pupils, that's not reasonable. It's not reasonable in terms of what the government should be what the government is saying it's doing, which is reducing travel, reducing social contacts, and it's not suitable in terms of the health and safety of staff in the school, particularly with the new virus, which is so much more transmissive, about 50% more transmissive than the original COVID. So what we would advise you to do is to contact your rep in the school and to hold a meeting of NEU members in the school, because this doesn't just affect you. If you've got more nursery children in, it affects all the teachers and all the support staff in the school. And I can quite see that many of you will be very unhappy about this. So hold a meeting. And when you're holding the meeting, ensure that through your rep, and if you don't have a rep, contact your local branch officer who will support you in doing this, that your concerns are relayed clearly to your head teacher. Now, if your concerns are not listened to, and if there isn't a resolution which you are satisfied with and your other NEU members in the school are satisfied with, then we have instructed the regions to move quickly to an indicative ballot. And what that means is that members get together and they have a ballot, they have a vote about whether they would be prepared to take industrial action. And if members are prepared to say that they would do that in sufficient numbers in the school, then we will inform the head teacher. Now, what we find normally is that just having the votes and just informing the head teacher that you do not want the whole nursery to be open because there are too many pupils in the school already, and this is not good for the school. It certainly won't get COVID down in society. We can't have schools closed in name only. They've got to be closed except for key worker and vulnerable children in reality. And that isn't the case if every parent can send their child to nursery. Then you can say that and you can vote on that and your head can be informed that you are prepared to take action on that. And what we find is when you do that, in most cases, you get a resolution very quickly. You don't have to move to full industrial action. And we found, for example, in Coventry last week, where the local authority was saying that, so far too many children had to be in schools and nurseries. What we found was the threat of a local authority-wide ballot, just of members, to say that they would be prepared to move towards industrial action, got that resolved within 24 hours. In Redbridge, members got together because the local authority was saying that they had to be in school whether or not they were delivering in-person teaching. So if they were doing remote teaching, they had to be in school. Now that means you have to travel to school, you have to be in school, there's more travel, there's more contacts, and it's not necessary. And just saying, right, we're not happy about this, we're going to have an indicative ballot, meant that Redbridge changed its position. So, it's very, very important that we move now to show the strength of the union, to have those meetings, and if you're unhappy about things, convey your concerns and expect that there will be a proper response to those concerns. In a pandemic, it's really important that you are not done to, but that you are done with. Amy, your question that you're currently closed due to a positive case of COVID and you've got just on sick pay, there is also, the government does have another payment of £500, which is called a self-isolation payment. It is available. It's a discretionary payment of £500 if you're told to self-isolate and you can't work from home. And it's administered by local authorities. So employers, your employer, should provide the names of all the staff who've been instructed to self-isolate to the self-isolation service hub run by the local authority. And if they meet the criteria, and I can't see any reason why you won't meet the criteria, then you are eligible for a £500 payment. We've also learned from John Hayes, who's an NEU member, a head teacher member, and he's on the NEU Leadership Council, giving us really good information. And he said that many local authorities have said that they will find they will fund nurseries at the normal level, regardless of the census day. So could the NEU put a list up to pressure other local authorities to do that? And absolutely will do. And John's also said, we'll be sending advice to leader members about funding. And of course, we will absolutely be sending that advice to our leadership members. Is there any question I didn't answer there?
I think, Mary, you covered that set of three superbly well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to build on Mary, what you were just saying, as we move into a set of questions about funding. But it's really fantastic just watching some of the comments in the chat. So Catherine Evans from Southwark in South London and Rebecca Goodman from Greenwich in London, both saying that their local authorities are either advising only partial opening or in some cases no opening at all. Now, that's really helpful information. And if you are on the call tonight and you are in an area where your local authority is being supportive of partial opening or non-opening, please put that information in the chat. We can then collect it together and we'll have a list of authorities that we can use as good examples. In the same way, and just before I come to Kevin on funding, Neve Sweeney has advised us that in Cambridgeshire, the local authority is being very flexible in its support around funding rather than simply operating on the numbers in attendance. Amy Kilpatrick telling us the same in relation to Newcastle. In contrast, I'm seeing comments from Marion Betts around Oxfordshire saying that all nurseries must stay fully open to everybody. Angela Blacker saying that Birmingham aren't providing the funding when the numbers are down. So what we need are more and more of these fantastic, strong examples where local authorities are being really supportive of early years nursery provision, supportive of the schools, and supportive of the decisions that protect not just our members, but also the families of the children who are attending those schools. So Kevin, I'm just going to come to you with some funding questions, and we'll do our best to give responses to them. So Angela, once again, I was just mentioning your own situation. We've got a question from you. Angela says in Birmingham, the nursery schools, there's a massive issue about funding. Head's been told today that nursery schools that are fully open will be funded for all the children on roll, even if they're not attending in the forthcoming census. So that's good news for nursery schools. But the nursery schools that have decided to only open for key workers and vulnerable, the council is not going to fund all the children. Now, that's a really punitive act, and she's saying that it means that her nursery school potentially faces a deficit of approaching £100,000. Question from Catherine Gardner, who says, how can we make the funding of nursery provision sustainable immediately and secure proper funding going forwards? Catherine Barnett. A huge funding concern, she says, with, I have to say, some capital letters. So thank you, Catherine. I've heard today that there may be some shift in the plan to fund on actual census data. Do the panelists know any more about this? Obviously, the concern is that we're operating at reduced numbers, only open to vulnerable and critical workers due to Section 44 letters, and this has left us between a rock and a hard place. Can't open fully to attract the full funding, but don't have the support of the government concerning our safety. Catherine, could you at some point just let us know where you're working, what the local authority is? That would be really helpful as well. And Nicola Duggan, I thought you would still receive funding if you're providing remote learning for children. Is this not correct? And Nicola is based in Consett. So, Kevin, a range of questions, but they all come back to some fairly common issues. I hope you can help us, Kevin. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin. And these are obviously vital questions, and it is not always possible to be completely categoric about the answers, because whoever said that there are change of plans coming, we keep hearing rumours about that. So things that we say tonight might not be true tomorrow. So there is rumour around. Angela's point about Birmingham, I think it's vital that we are pressing Birmingham Council that their behaviour is punitive. It's an attempt to blackmail around the question of safety, and there are two routes to take with that. One is that Birmingham, like London, is in the heart of this pandemic. We need to reduce social contacts in Birmingham, and Birmingham Council should be put under pressure by that. Do get in touch with the local Birmingham branch of the NEU, which is in contact with the council. We need to put pressure on them not to take that punitive approach. We also need to put pressure on them to understand that if you are doing key worker and vulnerable in person, then you are also doing your level best to do remote learning for the children who aren't there, and that does need funding as well. And both settings, whether the setting says it's open fully or whether it says it's key worker and vulnerable, it will have nothing like the whole number of children. We do need to address local councils, and John Hayes's question is helpful on that. There are councils that are doing the right thing, and we are getting a list together of the councils that are doing the right thing. That will be useful to put pressure on in Birmingham, but we do need to change the central government's point of view on it. That's why the petition, the letters to your MPs, the tweet your MPs really matter as well. Now, there is a point in saying, if they don't fund the sector won't exist, and then the government has a huge problem. They know that that's the case. We need to make sure that they are aware of the concerns that you have, both for your setting, but also for our whole community. There are questions of safety at the settings, but I wouldn't say it's more important, but the question of the total number of social contacts, bringing that down when we're at 1,500 deaths, and when the Prime Minister is saying that the ICU is in danger of being overrun, it really matters that we get social contacts down. So I think it is a matter of putting pressure and contacts at that local level, contacting your branch, making sure that all the PVI and maintained settings in the area are making the same points to the council as loudly as we can. So I'll stop there and see if people come back on that.
No, thank you very much, Kevin. Mary, did you want to add on some of those issues? Thank you.
So the situation is changing. I was in a meeting today with Vicky Ford, who's the Children's Minister, and the issues around the funding for early years and nurseries were clearly made to her. She understands the situation, and it was clearly explained to her that, the rock and a hard place that so many nurseries are in. If you don't fully open, you're not going to get funding, particularly with the decision to fund now on actual numbers rather than last year's numbers. And indeed that issue was raised by Kate Green when she responded to Gavin Williamson's announcement in the House of Commons last Wednesday. She raised the issue directly of funding for early years and the precarious place that the sector is in. So we are putting the pressure on with funding in every way we can. And we wish there was a magic wand which we could wave tonight to say we can, address these funding issues, which we know are absolutely critical and real. But there is a question about, how can we raise the profile of the sector? Well, one of the best ways of raising the profile of the sector is becoming active within the NEU and the NEU's campaign. The NEU's campaign to rectify the funding for the sector, to put it on a sustainable funding. 3,000 letters to MPs overnight. That is important. MPs do not like receiving letters from nursery professionals. They won't like receiving letters from parents saying my nursery is under threat because they cannot survive. They've gone into deficit. And what am I going to do with my children when I need that nursery place? The issues around the role of nurseries, particularly for deprived pupils, the reason why a Conservative government gives free funded hours to deprived pupils is because they know of the importance of early years for those pupils in particular, for their social development, for their language development, for their physical development, for their interaction with other people, with adults. So join our campaign, and let's put pressure on now to do what we can to try and get this funding situation rectified. It's a central element of our campaign, and we are putting all our energies into achieving that. But we won't do it if we don't get thousands and thousands and thousands of professional early years professionals and parents to join that campaign, and grandparents. That's really, really essential. We want to get those funds. We've got 7,000 who signed the petition. We want to get that to 100,000. We've got 3,000 letters to MPs. We want to get that to 100,000. We want MPs' postbags to be absolutely, their email boxes to be absolutely flooded with emails and with letters and the petition, so that it has to be debated in Parliament. So get behind the NEU's campaigning.
And can I also say, I said earlier that we'll be sending out a survey. We think it'll go tomorrow evening, and that will be about the development of the campaign, but it will also allow us to ask you to get the most up-to-date information about what bubble sizes are, about how many children are in settings, and having that information on a national basis will be really important in terms of feeding back to you what's happening elsewhere. You'll be able to use that with pressing your council and also putting pressure on the government. So do look out for that survey tomorrow evening when it arrives in your inbox.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And Mary, you really strongly reinforce the importance of getting parents involved. And I think particularly in a campaign of this nature, if parents are allowed to understand that the provision that their child attends is in some way threatened, its survival is being threatened because of a failure to commit to fund during a period when children are out of school because of COVID, then they will absolutely support us. And every teacher, every TA, every leader on this call should feel really comfortable in just being very public about the fact that there is a petition. The link is in the chat. Click on the link, see it. The wording of that petition is not something that any of us should be embarrassed to publicize. Get it in your local paper, talk to your local radio, just use any links, social media links that you have to promote the petition there. Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you, Kevin. And the next set of questions that we're going to be looking at are around the configuration of provision within early years settings. I'm going to read through 4 questions. They've got different flavors, but once again, they have a kind of common underlying concern. So Vicky Harper, is it acceptable to open to all our nursery pupils and then split them into 2 key worker bubbles and keep them separate? So the answer to that is going to depend very heavily upon space and staffing, but the question is still there. Joe Benge, has the union taken a position on a maximum size of bubbles in early years settings? Okay, once again, it will depend, but we'll give you the best answer we can, Joe. We've got a question from someone they've not given their name, but saying that the teaching assistants in their school are looking after key pupils, key worker pupils, whilst teachers are teaching remotely. What can they do, as at times there are bubbles that are over 20? Particular concern because many of the TAs are black members and at greater risk from COVID. Ryan Atkins, thank you, Ryan, from Coventry. What's the NEU stance on staff working between bubbles in schools? So we've got the size of bubbles, the organisation, the staffing of them, and moving between them. Mary, are you happy to respond? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. So, Vicky, is it acceptable to open to all nursery pupils and to split them into 2 key worker bubbles and keep them separate? We don't think it is acceptable to open to all nursery pupils because of what we've been saying all the time about that will be increasing the number of, I think you're in a school, that will be increasing the number of children in the school, increasing the number of social contacts, increasing the number of parents meeting at the school gate. So, and splitting them into 2 key worker bubbles will not mitigate against having a whole nursery, the nursery open to all pupils. Although, of course, you should split pupils in larger numbers into bubbles. So, no, we don't think that splitting them into 2 bubbles negates against having the whole class open. And again, if that is a concern and you are concerned about that and the staff in your school are concerned, then have a meeting, express your concerns to the head teacher. If you have a rep, express the concerns through the rep. If not, do that through the branch. And let's see what movement can be made with regard to that concern. Joe asked, have we taken a position on maximum size of bubbles in earlier settings? We haven't. We've never taken a position on the maximum size of bubbles because it's dependent on the space in the class and on the staff. But what in joint guidance that we are developing with Unison, we are moving to looking at there should be no more than 15% of pupils in a school. We think that sort of is probably about an acceptable number, because if the government's saying the steps we've taken have reduced attendance by 85%, what that means is schools and nurseries should have about 15% of pupils and children in them. So we don't have a position on maximum size of bubbles, but we're moving to a position on maximum attendance in schools and nursery. Staff should not move between bubbles. It negates the whole purpose of bubbles if you're moving between them, because that's the way you're spreading. If a child is infected or a member of staff is infected, then you're spreading the infection between 2 groups which should be kept entirely separate. The whole purpose of a bubble is to keep that bubble entirely separate. And whoever's attending anonymously, I think that's a really difficult situation. I think it's really difficult if all the teachers are teaching remotely and the teaching assistants, who are largely lower paid and black and more vulnerable, are in school. I do think that is an issue to get your local branch to support you with, and to get the region in to support you with, because there are all sorts of issues being raised there about equality, about safety, and about what's going on in the school. I think that if it is open, then there should be teachers there teaching in person as well as teaching remotely. I don't think that's a good situation for them to be in. So we don't think they should be overloaded. We don't think there should be too many pupils in there, but there shouldn't be a division in who's doing the in-person teaching and supporting in an environment. It's quite toxic, that, and I think that needs to be. I think you do need to get in touch with the region, and I do think you need to make it clear that that situation is affecting black staff disproportionately, because that is a serious concern. I'm quite worried about that, actually. I don't like the sound of that, and I think it's a serious issue which you need to raise.
Thank you very much, Mary. And we're coming towards the last 5 minutes or so of the time that we've got. I'm going to be posing one more question to Kevin, then I'll come to Mary for some final comment. But just before we do, I've just been picking up a couple of things from the chat. First of all, Magdalena, I haven't seen your surname anywhere, Magdalena. I know you're from Newham, you've told us that much. And Magdalena is telling us that she is a relatively new member of the NEU, just joined in the last week or two. welcome on board, Magdalena, but also that having joined the NEU and understanding the power of the union to support her and help her, she has already volunteered to become a rep in her workplace. And Magdalena, that's a fabulous example. Thank you for doing that. Please do get in touch so that we know what you're doing, where you're working, and we can give you the support and training that is necessary. You may already be in touch with NEU colleagues in Newham anyway. And a lovely message as well from Sam Barut, also London-based as it happens. Sam is working in an early years setting. I didn't get all the details, Sam, in Tower Hamlets. And Sam says that we really should be putting out a positive message, a really encouraging message to all the leaders in early years settings who have taken the right ethical stance, the right safety stance, and regardless of the fact that they may be feeling considerable pressure from the local authority, from the government, they've said, no, we're only going to admit into our school the number of pupils that we can manage safely and appropriately with the staff that we've got without putting anybody in jeopardy. So Sam, thank you for that message. And there are an awful lot of leaders who are making those right decisions, and they do need all of our support around them. So thank you, Sam, for that example. Kevin, I promised you a kind of final question, and then I'd come to Mary for some completing words. And the question comes from Wayne Biswas, who is based in Surrey by the look of it. He says that his Conservative MP for Carshalton and Wallington, I think it is, replied back to the letter that he had forwarded regarding early years. So Wayne has done the right thing. He's written to his MP. He's said that there's something's not right. And the MP has responded by saying that the government's latest advice from SAGE is that early years are safe. The MP has regurgitated all of the government's position. And Wayne wants to know what next steps should he take? How can he take forward his concerns and the concerns of the colleagues that he works with? Thank you, Kevin.
Well, thanks, Wayne, and thanks, Robin, for that question. The NEU is really proud of the degree to which we've followed the science, and we read the SAGE papers and we listen to what the SAGE scientists are saying, and we think it's really important to do that. And there is just one degree of complication. The SAGE scientists do think the younger a child is, the less they transmit the virus. They do think that. But that doesn't obviate the fact that earlier settings being open means far more contacts in our society. So just in the last couple of days, we heard Stephen Reicher, who is a scientist on SAGE, who points to nurseries being open as a problem with the current level of restrictions. Susan Mitchie, who is an advisor at the SAGE, she also points to the nursery settings being open as a problem. Now, they're not necessarily talking about the same question precisely about whether a young child transmits or not. They're talking about the fact that parents bringing children to nursery settings, that all of that is more contact, more movement in our society. So that's one response, is that SAGE many people involved with SAGE are worried that nurseries being open means the restrictions are not high enough, especially with this new variant of the virus. And our second concern, and we do not have good data on this, but we think the precautionary principle should apply. Even if early years children transmit less, early years practitioners are so much closer to those children. So even if they're shedding less of the virus, you are so much, they're on your lap. You are looking after them with that degree of closeness, that makes a real difference as well. So we do think there are concerns about safety for staff, and we want to have the best ventilation. We want to have the smallest bubble sizes. We want to have medical masks for vulnerable staff. We want CEV people at home. There are concerns about safety of staff, but there's also still that concern about the safety of our society. Stephen Reicher was on the Today programme this morning, and when he was on yesterday morning or the day before, he was saying nurseries being open was an issue. Susan Mitchie, another advisor to SAGE, she also was saying that nurseries being open is an issue. So I would actually, Wayne, go back to your MP and say that you've been on this call and you've said, I'll just write those names in the chat if I can, and say that those scientists, or look at our Facebook page, because we've put the little video clips of those scientists saying that on those video pages, and go back to him with that.
Thank you, Kevin. And Rebecca Winston just also posted something in the chat. It was a little bit cheeky, but I think she's spot on. Rebecca said, and of course, you can always invite him to come and spend a day in your shoes. Now, right at the moment, we know that's not possible, but my goodness, would the view be different if more of our serving politicians actually did spend a day in early year settings and in the provision, fabulous provision that so many of you make. And Mary, just some final words, if you would.
Well, Robin, you've just given me, when I was head of education at Kingston University, we had a very big primary and early years undergraduate and postgraduate programme. And I was told, I'm secondary trained and I was a secondary English teacher. And when I went to Kingston, I was told very clearly that I knew nothing about primary and nothing about early years, and I had to learn. And of course, I accepted that absolutely. And I remember spending several days in various early years settings working with little children. I can tell you at the end of that day, I was more exhausted than I've ever been in the whole of my life. And my respect for early years professionals and the calm, purposeful way they deal with our youngest children, who are the most vulnerable, who need the most support, who need the most help, so that they can, you know, stop just thinking about themselves and actually start to see how they can play with others, what it is like to be part of a bigger society in a safe and constructive and imaginative way. And I spent also it was a wonderful time playing with children and seeing their imaginations and how they were being developed and how their speech and language was being developed and how their fine motor skills were being developed and how they were learning through play, because play for children is work. It's through play that children learn how to become older, and they play about being fire people, they play at cooking, they play at writing through emergent writing. They know what they start to practice what it is like to be older through play. And for children, play is quite hard work, and they need help to be able to play well and to treat each other well and to learn about kindness. And you can't just have what you want, and you can't hit somebody if you don't like what they're doing. And it's where they learn how to be part of a wider society. So that work is absolutely essential. For many disadvantaged poor children, nursery might be one of the very few places that they go which isn't their home. So for them, it gives them a place to play and outdoor play and a chance to socialise, a chance to get some good food. So all these things are just essential. We know how essential early years are, and we know how I am absolutely sincere in my respect for the professionalism and the knowledge of early years practitioners. The knowledge is very detailed, it's very special, and all the focus on an academic curriculum in schools can downplay and not value the specific and particular knowledge that early years professionals have. And for the NEU, we think it's really important that rather than going too quickly to an academic curriculum in reception, that early years practices continue. We know in the most effective countries in the world for early years, that the early years play and provision lasts for much longer, until the pupils are till the children are about 6 or 7. If you look at Finland and Sweden and other places where there are really good educational outcomes when children are leaving school, when young people are leaving school, it's because they've had a much longer and richer experience of early years. So that's the NEU position. We don't think children should be forced into writing too early, forced into reading too early. I mean, they will do those things much better if they are given a rich early years provision and curriculum. And that's what we are fighting for. So when you join our campaign, the campaign is for now, but it's also for the future. It's to build the strength in the sector, to build our voice in that sector, to get more members involved in the sector, in the union's campaigns, so that we can do more with you and you can do more for yourselves with our support, because you are the experts. We are there to support you, organising yourself, raising your voices, making that case to the government and to parents and to everyone else. We want to work with you. We don't work for you, we work with you, and it's your expertise and your experience and your professionalism that is the bedrock of our union work. We work for you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you to the well over 2,000 people who've joined us at various points during this call. Thank you to Sam Riddle for providing BSL interpretation throughout that time. And I would ask all of you who've been on the call tonight to talk about this call with your colleagues this evening and tomorrow. Post the link to the live broadcast that will have been recorded and available on the NEU's YouTube channel. And please work together with the leaders in your settings to find ways of managing your early years communities through this challenging time. You have the union to support you. Make those calls, make those contacts, sign the petition, tweet about it, tell everybody about it. And thank you again so very much for your involvement this evening. Bye for now.